Today, we are going to look at Karens who faced the most gruesome deaths. From balcony selfies gone horribly wrong to fatal confrontations over coffee cups, these stories reveal how extreme entitlement and stubborn defiance can lead to shocking, irreversible consequences. It was August 14, 2018, in the coastal town of Pacifica, California. A warm, late morning with steady waves and light wind along the shoreline. Weekend crowds filled the beach, and a small local cable crew collected background footage for a lifestyle segment, wide shots of surfers, vendors, and swimmers moving in the water. One of the beachgoers was 42-year-old Melissa Davenport, familiar to regulars for her habit of correcting strangers and challenging staff. She worked as a freelance event planner, and neighbors said she often carried that assertive attitude everywhere she went. Weighing around 240 pounds, she used a wide, soft-top longboard for stability, since she wasn't an experienced surfer. Earlier that morning, witnesses said she was already paddling beyond the beginner zone, speaking loudly about how she understood the water better than the staff monitoring conditions. Regular surfers noted she'd been warned repeatedly about the breakwater currents on past visits, but she brushed off every caution as unnecessary advice meant for inexperienced riders. Lifeguards had issued early warnings about a strong side current pushing toward the old breakwater at the north end. One guard approached Melissa as she dragged her board toward the water, reminding her to stay within the main swim zone. Melissa immediately raised her voice, insisting the warnings were exaggerated and that she was not some beginner needing constant supervision. When the guard pointed out that her ankle leash was loose, she dismissed him, saying it felt restrictive and she would adjust it later. That looseness left extra slack in the cord, which later allowed the board to drift just far enough for the leash to snap tight with force. The cable crew's roaming camera briefly captured Melissa walking into the surf, while making comments to nearby swimmers about lifeguards power tripping. She paddled past the first breaking waves, continuing to talk loudly about how people exaggerate currents to scare tourists. The current pushed her steadily northward, but she ignored repeated gestures from the lifeguard tower to angle back toward the center. She tried to stand, but the front edge of her board dipped under the surface. The board tilted forward, and she fell off. Witnesses said she attempted to surface immediately, but the side current had already pushed her board toward the submerged rocks near the breakwater. According to several beachgoers, Melissa surfaced once, coughing, with her arms moving toward the board. As the current pushed the longboard into the rocks, the leash reached full tension. Witnesses said they saw her body jerk downward when the stretched leash pulled her underwater. People on the breakwater reported hearing her yell moments before the current rotated her sideways. A small retreating wave pulled her in the direction of the rocks again, and her head lifted above the water only briefly. Footage from the cable crew's distant camera later confirmed that the longboard had drifted into the breakwater, its nose catching on a submerged lip of stone. The board stayed wedged at an angle while the current continued to push water past it. A few seconds later, beachgoers closest to the breakwater reported hearing a single dull impact, consistent with her head striking one of the submerged stone surfaces beneath the chop. Lifeguards went in immediately, with one calling for backup as the other swam toward her. A brief lull in the current allowed them to pull her to shore, but she showed no movement when they lifted her above the waterline. CPR began right away, and beach staff cleared the area. EMTs arrived about 5 minutes after the emergency call and took over the resuscitation efforts, continuing CPR while assessing her condition. Their work lasted only a short time before they signaled to stop. Officials later confirmed that Melissa Davenport died from blunt head trauma, consistent with striking submerged rock after the tightened leash pulled her into the breakwater. Footage from the cable crew helped verify the sequence of events and her earlier disregard of warnings. The town later expanded its current zone markers and updated safety briefings, citing the case as a preventable incident. It was February 11, 2018, in a quiet suburban neighborhood in Dayton, Ohio. The sky was gray, the air cool, and residents were casually setting up tables for the community garage sale. Most people sorted boxes slowly, greeting neighbors and arranging items along their driveways without hurry. One of the participants was 46-year-old Carla Madsen, a part-time home organizer known for treating the annual sale like a competition. Her job involved critiquing how people arranged their spaces, and neighbors said she often carried that same attitude into community events. She had already told several people she intended to run the best table this year after feeling overlooked at the last sale. So when she stepped outside and decided her driveway looked too dim, her irritation started immediately. Carla flung open her garage and dragged out plastic bins filled with old decorations and household items. When one neighbor mentioned that the lighting wouldn't matter until buyers arrived later, Carla snapped back and accused them of undermining her setup. She shifted her bins around sharply, reorganizing and reorganizing her tables while muttering complaints each time something wasn't perfectly aligned. Still unhappy, she decided the driveway needed extra lighting. Instead of buying new equipment, she pulled out a plastic storage bin filled with extension cords she had collected over the years, some frayed, some taped, and one with a several-inch strip of exposed copper wire. When a nearby resident gently suggested that a few cords looked unsafe, Carla raised her voice, insisting everything worked fine last year and refusing the offer of a spare cord. She stretched the cords across her driveway toward the outdoor outlet, but instead of laying them flat, she dragged an old metal shelving rack closer to keep them out of the walkway. The bottom of the rack was damp from overnight moisture, and several witnesses said they saw her shoving it back and forth hard enough that it scraped loudly across the concrete. One neighbor later recalled hearing her muttering angrily as she tried to wedge the cords behind it. By 9:35 a.m., 2 cords were already plugged in. The light stayed off because the final connection had not been made yet. Carla crouched down with the damaged cord, the one with the exposed copper, and braced her other hand firmly on the damp metal rack as she reached toward the outlet. A man standing on his porch directly across the street reported seeing a quick blue flash under the rack, followed by a sharp popping snap. The exposed wiring had come into contact with the wet metal surface, energizing the entire frame. Because Carla was leaning on it for support, the current traveled through the rack and directly into her body. The same witness said he saw her body go rigid before she dropped face first onto the concrete. Several residents on the block later reported a brief flicker of lights inside their homes at the same moment. People approached her driveway but stopped short, unsure if the rack or outlet was still live. Someone yelled to cut the breaker, and a neighbor ran into the garage to shut it off, sending the lights dark at once. Emergency responders arrived minutes later, and neighbors watched from the sidewalk as paramedics assessed her, though no one close by could hear the details. Inspectors later reviewed the cords, outlet, and shelving rack. They concluded that the exposed copper, the damp metal surface, and Carla's direct hand contact created a complete electrical path the moment she tried to connect the final cord. Officials confirmed that she died at the scene from cardiac arrest, caused by fatal electrocution consistent with household current under wet contact conditions. The next day, her family removed all the old electrical supplies from the garage and hired a professional to update the wiring and replace the outdoor outlet. It was May 3, 2017, in Mesa, Arizona, on a warm, clear afternoon. The grocery store's parking lot was busy, with carts moving between rows and cars shifting slowly through the front drive. Sun glare bounced off windshields, making it harder for drivers to see pedestrians stepping into the lane. One of the shoppers leaving the store was 42-year-old Dana Mullis, a medical billing clerk known in her neighborhood for arguing over small issues and demanding managers for minor problems. And that afternoon was no different. Witnesses said that inside the store she had already caused a scene over expired coupons, insisting the cashier honor them anyway, and asking for the manager twice. Several shoppers saw her leave the checkout line visibly frustrated. Dana walked toward her sedan parked in one of the closest spaces. At the same time, a compact car pulled into the stall beside hers, stopping slightly over the painted line. According to people loading groceries nearby, Dana noticed instantly and launched into complaints, waving her arms at the driver and demanding they fix how they parked. Those who witnessed it said she spoke loudly enough that several rows of shoppers turned to follow the scene. As the exchange continued, Dana stepped backward while still facing the compact car. Witnesses later said she made small, abrupt backward steps. More yelling, another step, more pointing, without looking behind her. The store's security camera showed that she moved into the drive lane at an angle, still engaged in the midst of the argument. At the same time, a pickup truck was turning through the lane toward the store exit at roughly 8 to 10 miles per hour. The driver later explained that a large SUV parked near the corner blocked his view of anyone walking out between the cars. As he turned, the truck's front fender cleared the blind spot just as Dana backed into the lane. Footage showed the driver hit the brakes immediately, but the distance was too short. The truck made contact with Dana at low speed. Witnesses estimated it looked similar to a parking lot bump, but because she was already leaning backward and unprepared, the impact spun her off balance. A shopper pushing a cart said she fell straight back, striking the back of her head on the rounded edge of the concrete curb. The sound made several people stop in place. The truck stopped immediately, and Dana remained unresponsive. A trained bystander checked her airway, while another called for help. Store staff brought a first aid kit and cleared the area. Fire department medics arrived within minutes, assessed her severe head injury, and prepared her for transport. Later that evening, authorities confirmed that Dana died from severe blunt head trauma caused by the backward fall. The medical report noted that the low-speed impact alone was not fatal, but the unbraced fall onto the curb created enough force to cause a catastrophic injury. In the weeks that followed, the store repainted crosswalk lines, added a pedestrian-only walkway in front of the main row, and posted signs reminding customers to watch for moving cars before stepping backward into the lane. It was October 9th, 2016 in Manila, Philippines, on a warm, humid evening as hotel guests stepped onto their balconies to watch the sunset over the bay. The sky was clear, the water reflected orange light, and the upper floors were filled with people taking photos of the skyline. On the 27th floor was 29-year-old Lorna Del Monte, an office worker from Quezon City, on a weekend trip with two friends. Lorna was known among people who traveled with her for pushing limits during photos, climbing railings, leaning too far, and arguing with anyone who suggested she stop. She had already been pacing in and out of the balcony, complaining loudly that the railing was ruining her angles. The balcony had standard safety features: a waist-high railing, smooth floor tiles, and a lightweight patio chair. None of it was meant for climbing, but Lorna dragged the chair toward the edge anyway. Her friends told her several times to step down, but she brushed them off, telling them to quit exaggerating. Guests on the next balcony noticed her behavior. One woman leaned over and said in a calm voice that standing on the chair wasn't safe on a high floor. Lorna immediately snapped back, raising her voice so half the floor could hear. She insisted she had every right to take photos however she wanted, adding that she paid for this balcony and could use it any way she sees fit. The visitor tried again to warn her about the wobbling chair, but Lorna cut her off, telling her to mind her own business. Her friends tried to intervene, but Lorna waved them away, saying they were ruining her shot. She climbed onto the patio chair, holding her phone outward, repeating that people needed to stop policing everything. More guests stepped onto their balconies to capture the sunset. Several noticed Lorna shifting her stance on the chair, trying to tilt her phone farther out over the rail. A guest 2 floors above later reported seeing the chair legs slide slightly, each time she leaned forward. At 5:56 p.m., the light was at its brightest, a deep orange. Lorna leaned farther over the balcony, telling her friends she needed one more photo. Witnesses on the balcony said she pushed her whole upper body past the railing, while stretching her arm outward with her phone. As she shifted her weight, the back leg of the chair slid on the smooth tile. Just an inch, her friend later said, but enough to throw off her footing. Since her upper body was already extended beyond the railing, that tiny slide pulled her center of gravity forward. The chair tipped, and her upper body went over with it. Guests on the 26th and 25th floors later reported hearing a sharp, heavy impact on the utility roof below. Several people on the pool deck looked up after hearing the same sound and notified hotel staff. From inside the room, one friend immediately called for help, while the other kept repeating that she had told Lorna to get off the chair. A guest in the neighboring room contacted emergency services after hearing the thud and seeing movement on the lower roof. Hotel security reached the utility roof within minutes and cleared the surrounding area. Lorna's friends were escorted indoors while responders conducted an on-scene assessment and secured the location for emergency crews. Investigators concluded that Lorna died from multiple blunt force injuries consistent with a high-rise fall, noting the unstable chair, her position beyond the railing, and her refusal to step down as contributing factors. Staff later recovered her phone, which contained a partially framed bay photo taken seconds before the fall. Maintenance removed patio chairs from all upper-level balconies, and management added more prominent safety notices. It was June 28, 2017, at a public pool in Fairview, Washington, a small suburban city preparing for its busiest swim season. The afternoon was warm, and a steady line had formed at the entrance. Families carried towels, sunscreen, and pool toys, while the posted rules beside the gate reminded guests that outside food and drinks were not permitted past the check-in area. Standing in line with a large iced coffee was 41-year-old Denise Halbrook, known among neighbors for heated confrontations over small regulations. Residents who lived near her townhouse described her as someone who often demanded to speak to management whenever things didn't go her way. The staff at a local grocery store had previously documented disputes with her over return policies, discount limits, and parking spaces. That afternoon at the pool, her behavior followed the same pattern. As she approached the front desk, the teenage attendant repeated the policy: no outside food or drinks. Most guests either finished their drinks or tossed them. Denise didn't. Witnesses said her posture changed immediately. She raised her voice, waved her coffee cup, and argued that she'd paid too much to give it up. She compared the rule to a nearby town's pool and leaned toward the counter, pointing at the sign while criticizing it loudly. The attendant repeated the standard response, but Denise grew more agitated, questioning his authority and gesturing with the cup. When nothing changed, CCTV showed her abruptly dumping the entire drink across the check-in computer. Coffee splashed over the keyboard, ran down the cords, and the monitor flickered as the system shorted. The attendant stepped back while the lifeguard supervisor signaled for help. People in line shuffled away, unsure what she would do next. After being told police were being contacted, witnesses said Denise muttered angrily and backed away from the counter, still shouting. Security footage showed her taking several quick steps backward without looking behind her. The ground had a thin, slick layer of water from swimmers all afternoon. According to bystanders, her heel slipped the moment it touched the wet patch. One person reported seeing her arm jerk outward as she tried to catch herself, but her momentum carried her back. CCTV captured her foot skidding, her body dropping, and her head striking the concrete edge with a loud impact. She did not move afterward. A bystander called for space while the supervisor dialed 911. Parents pulled their children aside as staff kept the walkway clear. EMTs arrived within minutes, assessed her where she fell, and witnesses said it was clear she remained unresponsive throughout. Later that afternoon, officials confirmed Denise Halbrook died from severe head trauma caused by hitting the concrete. Security footage showed the entire sequence: her argument at the desk, the backward steps into a wet area, the slip, and the fatal impact. The pool added more non-slip mats and strengthened procedures for enforcing gate rules during crowded hours. It was July 18, 2015, at a county fairgrounds in central Iowa. The afternoon was warm and sticky, food stands were crowded, and people moved between games, booths, and small attractions. Near the center of the fair, volunteers set up a simple stage for a corn dog eating contest sponsored by a local diner. It was meant to be slow, friendly, and easy. One of the participants was 45-year-old Karen Halford, a part-time receptionist known in her neighborhood for arguing with staff at nearly every community event. Volunteers recognized her immediately. She had caused problems at raffles, parking areas, and even kids' craft tables. Karen often treated rules as optional, and insisted she deserved exceptions whenever she showed up. At registration, the organizer, Tom, explained the simple rules. Small bites, normal pace, water as needed. It wasn't timed. It wasn't a race. Witnesses said Karen cut him off almost immediately, talking over him and saying she didn't need instructions. Several people in line stepped aside as she kept arguing, insisting she would do it her own way. When Tom handed her the waiver, Karen objected again. A volunteer later said she argued for a couple of minutes, calling the form pointless, before finally signing with quick, forceful strokes. At the table, a front-row spectator saw her drag her tray closer, despite instructions to keep everything aligned for the cable recording. When Tom reminded her, she snapped that he was targeting her and refused to move it back. At 2:03 p.m., the contest began. Most people took small bites, laughed, and talked casually. Karen did the opposite. She grabbed each corn dog near the base and took large, fast bites, barely chewing. Several spectators later said it looked like she was trying to beat everyone, even though no one else was treating it like a competition. About 2 minutes in, she reached for her third corn dog. She bit off a large piece and tilted her head back to swallow it quickly. A nearby volunteer started to remind her to slow down, but Karen waved him off without breaking rhythm. Seconds later, she began coughing. Witnesses described it as short, sharp coughs at first, more like she was trying to push the food down. Then, according to security footage reviewed later, her upper body went rigid, and her arms pulled in close to her chest. The coughing stopped altogether. She reached for her water cup but dropped it before she could drink. Spectators saw Karen stagger sideways, knocking over her tray and spilling water across the platform. 2 people with basic first aid training stepped forward. One attempted abdominal thrusts while the other tried to check if anything was visible in her mouth, but nothing changed. The obstruction did not move. EMTs arrived within minutes. Ushers moved benches to clear a path as responders came through. From the edge of the crowd, people could see EMTs continuing airway checks and performing additional thrusts, but no visible response followed. The stage was closed off, and fair staff blocked the area with temporary fencing. Food-related events were canceled for the rest of the day. Later that evening, officials confirmed that Karen Halford died from a complete airway blockage caused by a large, unchewed piece of food. Security footage showed her ignoring the safety instructions, rushing through the contest, and refusing reminders to slow down. Fair organizers removed all eating competitions from future schedules and added updated guidelines stressing slow, careful consumption at public food activities. It was March 15, 2012, and Linda Morrison was doing what she did best, making retail workers miserable. The 52-year-old department store manager had just spent 45 minutes absolutely tearing into a teenage cashier over a $12 return at Westfield Shopping Center in Riverside, California. Linda's behavior that evening was textbook entitlement. She had berated the young employee relentlessly, demanding to speak with corporate headquarters and threatening to ruin the store's reputation online over a trivial policy dispute. Her voice carried throughout the store as she loudly proclaimed to other waiting customers that customer service was dead and the staff was completely incompetent. She wasn't finished there. Linda demanded the store manager provide written documentation of what she called policy violations and insisted on corporate contact information so she could file complaints with the Better Business Bureau. Her decade-plus experience as a retail manager had taught her exactly which buttons to push to make minimum wage workers squirm. After her exhausting 10-hour workday, this confrontation was just another Tuesday for Linda, who was known for her impossibly high standards and zero tolerance for anything less than perfection from service workers. As Linda rushed through the mall at 6:45 p.m., she was loaded down with multiple shopping bags and her oversized purse, wearing brand new leather-soled shoes she'd purchased that morning. She was already running late to meet her husband for dinner, adding to her already elevated stress levels. The ascending escalator she approached had been making concerning grinding noises for 2 weeks. Maintenance requests sat unaddressed due to budget constraints, a detail that would prove crucial later. Distracted by a text from her husband about dinner plans, Linda stepped onto the escalator without paying attention. Her smooth leather soles found no grip on the recently cleaned, still damp metal steps. Near the top, physics took over. Her feet slipped completely on the wet surface, and as she grabbed desperately for the handrail, her heavy bags shifted her center of gravity backward. The momentum became unstoppable. Linda's head struck the sharp metal edge of an escalator step with devastating force, causing severe trauma that knocked her unconscious instantly. Her loose scarf became tangled in the escalator mechanism as panicked shoppers rushed to help. The emergency stop activated within 30 seconds, but Linda had already sustained fatal head trauma from the initial impact. Emergency responders arrived within 8 minutes, but she was pronounced dead at the scene due to a traumatic brain injury. The mall immediately shut down all escalators for safety inspections and installed additional warning signs. Investigation revealed the escalator met safety standards, but recommended more frequent maintenance schedules. The incident serves as a stark reminder that life can change in an instant, regardless of how much control we think we have over our circumstances. It was June 3, 2013, when Patricia Chen's relentless pursuit of food safety truth would lead to a horrific end at Eugene, Oregon's downtown farmers market. Patricia Chen, a 47-year-old food blogger, had made exposing questionable vendor practices her personal mission. Known for her abrasive interrogation style and complete disregard for social boundaries, Patricia had earned a reputation as the market's most dreaded visitor. Vendors would cringe when they spotted her approaching, knowing she would monopolize their time with aggressive questioning while driving away paying customers. Her blog followers praised her dedication, but those who encountered Patricia in person found her insufferably self-righteous and confrontational. She treated every vendor interaction like a criminal investigation, showing zero empathy for small business owners trying to make a living. That Saturday morning, she arrived with her laptop, ready to document what she suspected were fraudulent organic certifications at the bustling market. Patricia cornered an organic produce vendor for a grueling 20 minutes, loudly questioning his certification credentials and demanding to see documentation, while frustrated customers formed a growing line behind her. Her voice carried across the market as she announced she was exposing fraudulent organic claims and threatened to report him to state agriculture authorities. When the vendor politely asked her to lower her voice, Patricia declared she had every right to protect consumers from his lies and began filming him without permission. She blocked other customers from approaching the stand, completely oblivious to their mounting frustration as she continued her interrogation. Market management approached her multiple times, requesting she move along, but Patricia dismissed them with the same arrogant attitude that had made her so many enemies. Her tunnel vision and obsessive need to be right blinded her to everything else happening around her. At 10:30 a.m., Patricia moved behind the delivery truck to photograph produce boxes, her attention completely focused on her camera screen. The same obsessive focus that made her so insufferable now put her in mortal danger. The driver, unable to see her in his blind spot despite having mirrors, began backing up. The truck's backup alarm had malfunctioned, but even if it had worked, Patricia's history showed she rarely paid attention to anything that didn't serve her investigative agenda. She remained absorbed in her documentation, unaware of the truck moving toward her until it was too late. The truck's rear bumper struck Patricia with devastating force, knocking her to the ground and causing multiple fractures. The rear wheel rolled over her lower torso before the driver realized what had happened and stopped. Patricia suffered severe internal bleeding and went into shock, but remained conscious, unable to move from where she lay. Paramedics arrived within 6 minutes of the accident and provided immediate medical attention, but her injuries were too severe. Despite their rapid response, Patricia died from internal bleeding while being transported to the hospital, her final investigation ending in tragedy. The farmers market immediately implemented new safety protocols, including designated vehicle routes and mandatory spotters for all deliveries. They installed backup cameras and proximity sensors on all delivery vehicles to prevent similar accidents. The truck driver faced vehicular manslaughter charges but was ultimately found not criminally liable due to the equipment failure that disabled the backup alarm. Patricia Chen's death became a tragic reminder of how obsessive behavior and disregard for surroundings can have deadly consequences. It was September 12, 2014, when Margaret Thompson's dedication to neighborhood standards would lead to a tragic encounter in Charlotte, North Carolina. Margaret Thompson, 55, served as an active member of her neighborhood association in Oakwood residential area. She embodied the quintessential neighborhood enforcer, the type who measured grass heights with rulers, kept detailed logs of minor infractions, and believed her interpretation of community standards was absolute law. Margaret possessed an unwavering sense of superiority, treating every homeowner like a potential violator who needed constant supervision. She took immense pride in maintaining community standards and spent her days ensuring every resident followed the established guidelines. That afternoon, Margaret had confronted 3 different neighbors about various violations she discovered during her rounds. Her first stop involved a family whose children had created chalk art on their own driveway. Margaret's controlling nature emerged as she demanded they remove the colorful drawings immediately, citing community standards. The Johnson family became her next target when Margaret noticed their garbage cans remained visible from the street 30 minutes past the designated pickup time. Displaying classic entitled behavior, she threatened them with a $200 fine for this violation. Mrs. Garcia's rose garden caught Margaret's attention next. The roses had grown 2 inches over the property line, and Margaret's condescending attitude was on full display as she loudly berated the woman, insisting the overgrowth was destroying neighborhood property values. When a neighbor suggested Margaret was being unreasonable, her defensive superiority complex kicked in as she declared herself the only person who truly cared about maintaining standards and threatened to report them to city authorities. At 7:15 p.m., Margaret began her usual evening route to check properties and ensure compliance with neighborhood guidelines. She carried her phone and notebook to document any issues she observed during her walk. The weather was clear but windy, with gusts reaching up to 25 miles per hour throughout the day. A local utility company was performing routine power line maintenance in the area, with crews working on elevated lines despite the challenging wind conditions. Margaret stopped beneath a utility pole to photograph what she believed was an improperly maintained yard. 30 feet above her, a utility worker was securing a power line that had been loosened by the persistent wind. A sudden gust of wind caused the worker to lose control of a heavy metal cable clamp weighing 8 pounds. The clamp fell from the pole just as Margaret looked up after hearing the worker's warning shout. The metal clamp struck Margaret directly on the head, causing severe head trauma. She immediately collapsed and lost consciousness within seconds of impact. Other residents and the utility crew immediately called 911 and attempted first aid while waiting for emergency responders. Margaret was quickly transported to the hospital, where surgeons performed emergency surgery to address her traumatic brain injury. Despite the medical team's efforts, Margaret died 3 hours later from the severe head trauma she sustained in the accident. The utility company responded to the tragedy by implementing stricter safety protocols for work performed during windy conditions. They also improved their equipment securing procedures to prevent similar accidents. The neighborhood association established a memorial garden in Margaret's honor at the local community center, recognizing her dedication to the community despite the circumstances of her death. New safety regulations were adopted requiring ground-level safety zones during all overhead utility work, ensuring better protection for pedestrians and residents in the area. Margaret Thompson's final day of neighborhood enforcement ended in an unexpected tragedy, her relentless pursuit of violations ultimately placing her in the path of falling danger. It was October 8, 2015, when Susan Rodriguez's dedication to her children's education would lead to an unthinkable tragedy at Lincoln Middle School in Boise, Idaho. Susan Rodriguez was the kind of parent every school administrator dreaded encountering. The 43-year-old mother had developed a reputation as the school's most demanding and theatrical complainant, someone who seemed to thrive on creating drama and making scenes to get her way. While she claimed to advocate for students, her real motivation appeared to be the attention and sense of power she gained from intimidating school staff and disrupting normal operations. That evening, Susan had arrived a full 90 minutes before the scheduled school board meeting. True to form, she immediately launched into her attention-seeking routine, cornering the principal and demanding immediate changes to the lunch menu while threatening media exposure over food quality concerns. Her voice echoed through the hallways as she criticized the school's technology policies in front of other parents, performing for her audience as she declared the administration was failing their children and demanded a complete policy overhaul. When staff reminded her the meeting hadn't officially begun, Susan dramatically insisted her concerns were too important to wait. With her usual flair for theatrics, she demanded an immediate audience with the superintendent, pulling out her phone to film herself making accusations against school staff. These videos quickly found their way to social media, where she claimed the school was covering up serious issues, another calculated move in her ongoing campaign to position herself as the school's self-appointed watchdog. What Susan didn't fully grasp was the dangerous environment surrounding her that evening. Lincoln Middle School was in the midst of major renovations, with scaffolding and construction equipment scattered throughout the building. Construction workers had spent the day installing new lighting fixtures in the ceiling above the main hallway where Susan now stood. At 6:20 p.m., as Susan reviewed her presentation materials in the hallway outside the meeting room, she heard an ominous cracking sound from above. The renovation work had weakened a section of the ceiling tile, and the combination of the new lighting fixtures' weight and compromised structural integrity created a deadly hazard. The ceiling tile, along with a heavy light fixture, plummeted approximately 12 feet from above. Susan had no time to react as the debris struck her head and shoulder with devastating force. The impact knocked her unconscious immediately, causing a fractured skull and severe neck injury. Other parents and school staff rushed to help, calling 911 within minutes. Susan was quickly transported to the hospital where medical teams fought to save her life. Despite their efforts, she succumbed to complications from her head injury 2 days later. The investigation that followed revealed a sobering truth. Proper safety protocols had not been followed during the renovation work. The school district was forced to confront the reality that its oversight had contributed to a preventable tragedy. Susan's death sparked immediate changes. The school was temporarily closed for comprehensive safety inspections, and the district implemented new safety requirements for all construction work in occupied buildings. Her family, channeling their grief into purpose, worked with the district to establish safety guidelines that were adopted district-wide. Susan Rodriguez's story serves as a stark reminder that even the most routine activities can turn deadly when safety protocols are ignored. Her legacy lives on in the enhanced safety measures that now protect countless other parents and students throughout the district. It was August 19, 2016, when a routine grocery shopping trip in Mesa, Arizona, turned deadly for 49-year-old Carol Williams, a woman whose obsession with parking etiquette would ultimately cost her everything. Carol Williams wasn't just any ordinary shopper at the grocery store plaza in Mesa. She had earned a reputation as the parking lot's unofficial enforcer, someone who took it upon herself to police the behavior of fellow customers. Her mission was simple but consuming: ensure everyone followed proper parking etiquette. On previous occasions, Carol had made quite the spectacle of herself. She would follow SUV owners into stores, loudly demanding they move their improperly parked vehicles. She once blocked a store entrance for several minutes, announcing to bewildered customers that inconsiderate parking ruins shopping for everyone. When store management tried to intervene, Carol declared she was performing a public service and even threatened to organize boycotts against businesses that wouldn't support her crusade. Her methods were aggressive and confrontational. She would demand that store managers take down license plate numbers and permanently ban offending vehicle owners from parking lots. To Carol, this wasn't just about parking spaces, it was about justice, order, and doing what she believed was right for the community. That sweltering August afternoon, Carol had just finished her weekly grocery shopping. As she loaded bags into her car, something caught her eye that made her blood boil. A vehicle brazenly parked across 2 spaces in the busy weekend lot. The parking area was packed with shoppers, and Carol decided this transgression couldn't go unanswered. At exactly 2:45 p.m., Carol approached the offending vehicle with her usual determination. She had a note ready, prepared to deliver another lesson in parking courtesy. What she didn't notice was the teenage employee working nearby, collecting shopping carts with a motorized cart pusher. The cart collection equipment had been recently serviced, but the brakes weren't responding as sharply as they normally would. The young employee was managing a long train of carts, focused on his task and unaware that Carol had stepped between the parked vehicles. Focused entirely on writing her stern note about parking etiquette, Carol stepped backward without looking. She moved directly into the path of the approaching cart train just as the employee realized the danger and tried to stop. The reduced braking power of the cart pusher meant the momentum couldn't be halted in time. The lead cart struck Carol with enough force to knock her down onto the unforgiving asphalt. Her head hit the pavement with a sickening impact, and the weight of multiple carts rolled over her legs, causing immediate fractures. The parking lot fell silent except for the sound of scattered groceries and the employees' horrified shouts for help. Carol lay unconscious, her crusade for parking justice having led her to this tragic moment. Emergency services arrived within 10 minutes of the accident, their sirens cutting through the Arizona heat. Paramedics worked frantically to stabilize Carol, but the head injury was severe. She was rushed to the hospital where medical teams fought to save her life. 3 hours later, Carol Williams was pronounced dead from her head injury. The woman who had spent so much energy trying to correct others' behavior had become the victim of a tragic accident that could have been avoided. The grocery store responded by implementing comprehensive safety changes. New training programs were established for all cart collection employees, and the cart pusher maintenance schedule was completely overhauled. Additional safety mirrors were installed throughout the parking lot to improve visibility and prevent similar accidents. Perhaps most significantly, the store created a customer courtesy program designed to address parking issues through management intervention rather than allowing customer confrontations to escalate. Carol Williams' death serves as a sobering reminder that sometimes our desire to enforce rules and correct others can put us in harm's way, and that tragedy can strike in the most ordinary moments of our daily lives. It was July 4th, 2017, when a dedication to community service turned deadly for 46-year-old Jennifer Walsh at Riverside Park in Portland, Oregon, a woman whose relentless pursuit of perfection would ultimately cost her everything. Jennifer Walsh was a dedicated community volunteer who helped organize the annual 4th of July celebration at Riverside Park. Her responsibility was coordinating vendor setup and ensuring all safety protocols were followed during the event. But Jennifer's approach had become increasingly confrontational and rigid. She had spent 2 hours berating food vendors about their setup locations, insisting they move their booths despite having approved permits for their current spots. Jennifer demanded that the live music be turned down during sound check, threatening to call police about noise violations, even though the event had proper permits. Her demands escalated as she confronted families setting up picnic areas, claiming they were violating official event protocols and demanding they relocate to less desirable spots. When other volunteers suggested she was being too rigid, Jennifer declared she was the only one who takes event safety seriously and threatened to report violations to the city. The park was hosting its largest Independence Day celebration in years, with multiple food vendors, live music, and fireworks planned. Jennifer was checking on the setup of a temporary stage structure that had been erected by a local rental company. High winds earlier in the day had caused some concern about the stability of temporary structures throughout the park. The weather conditions made Jennifer even more vigilant about potential safety issues as she conducted her inspections. At 4:30 p.m., Jennifer was inspecting the stage area when she noticed some loose securing cables that immediately raised her concerns. Determined to get a better look at the rigging system, she climbed onto the stage platform to examine the overhead mounting points more closely. As she studied the connections, a sudden gust of wind struck the temporary structure with unexpected force. One of the overhead lighting trusses, weighing 150 pounds, shifted under the wind pressure and broke free from its mounting system. The heavy truss fell approximately 15 feet through the air. Jennifer tried to move out of the way, but there wasn't enough time or space to escape the falling equipment. The massive truss struck Jennifer with devastating force, causing severe chest and head injuries that left her trapped under the twisted metal and lighting equipment. The woman who had spent her day ensuring everyone else followed safety protocols had become the victim of a structural failure. Other volunteers and emergency responders worked frantically to free Jennifer from under the heavy equipment. Within 8 minutes, they had managed to lift the truss and extract her from the wreckage. Jennifer was immediately airlifted to the trauma center, where surgeons fought to save her life. Despite their efforts, she died from her injuries during emergency surgery. The Independence Day celebration was canceled immediately following the accident, All temporary structures were immediately inspected as officials worked to determine if other equipment posed similar risks. The tragedy prompted comprehensive changes in how Portland handled community events. New safety regulations were implemented requiring certified engineers to approve all temporary stage installations before any event could proceed. The days of relying solely on volunteer oversight for complex structural safety were over. The community established an annual safety award in Jennifer's name for outstanding volunteer service, ensuring her dedication would be remembered while emphasizing the importance of professional safety standards. Jennifer Walsh's death serves as a sobering reminder that good intentions and dedication must be balanced with proper expertise, and that sometimes the very commitment that drives us to serve our communities can put us in unexpected danger. It was July 11, 2015 in Bloomington, Minnesota. A mall was crowded with weekend shoppers moving between stores, food courts, and attractions. Music from kiosks mixed with the constant hum of conversation. On the second level, one of the escalators near the east wing was partially cordoned with a yellow caution cone, a reminder of recent cleaning. Most people diverted to nearby stairs or elevators, but not everyone chose to wait. Linda McClellan, 52, was a longtime resident of the Twin Cities and a regular mall visitor. She worked in property management, but was better known among local shop employees for her sharp tongue and short temper. Clerks recalled her demanding refunds or lecturing staff about service. Away from public spaces, she lived alone in a quiet apartment complex. Shopping was one of her routines, a way to pass time as well as exercise control in an environment where she felt she held authority. The escalator itself was standard for the mall, a two-story incline of steel steps with rubber handrails and grooved treads. Cleaning crews often mopped them late mornings, leaving cones for damp surfaces. The danger was not hidden. Slips on moving escalators can lead to severe head injuries due to the sharp metal edges. Mall policy relied on clear signage and cones rather than closing the escalators entirely, expecting visitors to heed the warnings. That afternoon, Linda noticed a janitor finishing his work near the base of the escalator. Dissatisfied with the streaks she thought she saw on the steps, she made her disapproval known, raising her voice at the worker. Witnesses later described her as visibly irritated, muttering as she walked. Without slowing, she stepped past the caution cone and onto the moving escalator, still clutching her shopping bags. Other shoppers hesitated but did not intervene, assuming she would steady herself. As she climbed, her heel slipped on a damp patch of metal. The shift was sudden. Her weight rocked forward, then snapped backward as she fought to steady herself. Her shopping bag swung wildly, pulling her further off balance. For an instant, she clutched at the handrail, fingers scraping, before her grip failed. Her body twisted awkwardly as she toppled. The fall was violent. Her back struck first, her head snapping against the jagged edge of a rising step. She slid downward, limbs jerking against the moving teeth of the machine, each ridge scraping fabric and skin. A red smear began to streak across the steps, darkening as blood pulsed from the wound at the back of her skull. Shoppers recoiled, some shouting, others frozen in horror. A man shoved toward the emergency button. The machinery jolted to a stop, leaving her body half-collapsed across the metal. Security and medical staff on scene rushed to her. CPR was attempted on the landing, but the extent of the head trauma was clear. The fractured skull had caused catastrophic damage, and she was declared dead before transport. Shaken shoppers were escorted away while staff draped barriers to block the view. In the days that followed, several mall workers were offered counseling, one janitor later admitting he avoided the East Wing entirely for weeks. Among frequent shoppers, the story spread by word of mouth rather than through official channels. Parents warning children to avoid escalators, clerks recalling the sound of her fall in hushed tones. Her family arranged a quiet burial at a local cemetery, declining press inquiries. It was May 22, 2016, at the London Zoo in Regent's Park, England. The day was mild, the crowd steady, and families lingered at the exhibits. The lion enclosure drew clusters of visitors. children pressing against the rail to glimpse the animals pacing the grassy habitat below. By mid-afternoon, the routine hum of chatter would break under a scene that left witnesses shaken and staff scrambling. Patricia Walker, 56, had taken the train from her home in Watford for what she described to neighbors as a casual Sunday outing. Known among acquaintances for her sharp tongue, conflict for her was routine, asserting control in everyday situations where she felt ignored. She had no real history of risk-taking in outdoor activities, but in public spaces, she frequently pushed against rules and restrictions, dismissing them as unnecessary. The lion exhibit was designed with multiple safety layers. A low rail kept visitors back several feet from a concrete lip, beyond which a dry moat dropped roughly 12 feet into the enclosure. The animals, 3 adult lions, occupied an open savanna space with grass, boulders, and logs. Clear signage warned guests to remain behind the barrier, and staff at the station often reminded anyone who leaned too close. Still, incidents of guests attempting to stretch over the railing for better photos were not uncommon. That afternoon, Patricia grew irritated after a staff member told her to step back. She complained loudly, accusing them of spoiling her visit. Ignoring repeated instructions, she leaned over the barrier, gesturing toward the lions as she mocked their inactivity. Several visitors nearby shifted uncomfortably, one father with a pram moving his children farther down the rail. Despite the warnings and visible signage, Patricia remained fixated, eventually leaning too far forward. Her shoe slipped against the smooth concrete edge, sending her weight past the point of balance. She pitched forward with a sudden cry, flipping over the rail and tumbling into the dry moat. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she landed hard, rolling onto the dirt floor below. For several seconds, the enclosure was silent, the lions pausing at the unexpected intrusion. Then 2 of them charged. The male struck first, clamping powerful jaws onto her shoulder. Patricia screamed, thrashing against the dirt, while a lioness swiped with extended claws, tearing into her arms and torso. Visitors screamed, others shielding children's eyes. Zoo staff responded within moments, deploying air horns and high-pressure hoses. The lions hesitated briefly under the blasts of water, but the male did not release his grip. Patricia's body twisted unnaturally as he pulled, blood streaking across the dirt. Within minutes, her movement slowed, then stopped entirely. Staff escalated efforts, finally forcing the lions back with repeated horns and sustained water streams, long enough to lure them into a holding pen. Emergency personnel entered only after the animals were secured. Patricia was pronounced dead at the scene, her body bearing massive trauma consistent with mauling. Witnesses, still clustered behind the rail, were led away quietly, many visibly shaken. Her relatives avoided questions about the circumstances when interviewed during her funeral. In a press conference, officials emphasized that the victim had disregarded posted rules and staff instructions, underscoring the limits of what safety measures could prevent when warnings were ignored. The zoo reinforced the barriers in the weeks that followed, raising railings and adding additional signage. It was August 19, 2017, in Austell, Georgia. The summer heat lingered over an amusement park, where crowds filled the park with noise and energy. The rides churned with mechanical rhythm, but beneath the excitement there was an unspoken tension. Later that evening, the park would be remembered for more than roller coasters and laughter. Melissa Daniels was 41, a marketing consultant from Atlanta, known for her blunt manner and impatience. Colleagues described her as sharp and outspoken, quick to point out incompetence as she saw it. She had steady work with small regional businesses and liked to project authority in public. Away from work, amusement parks were one of her indulgences. She followed ride enthusiasts' forums, often boasting she understood how restraints and ride systems worked. Her relationship with risk was one of control. She believed rules applied to others, not to her. Roller coaster rides rely on layered restraint systems, lap bars, shoulder harnesses, and seat belts, checked and locked by attendants before departure. The ride Melissa boarded, a looping steel coaster, used a rigid over-the-shoulder harness with an additional seat belt latch at the base. Operators required both to be secure before dispatch. Despite this, riders sometimes tried to test boundaries, pulling against restraints to prove how much movement was possible. That day, the coaster carried longer waits than usual. Temperatures were high, making crowds restless. Witnesses said Melissa complained aloud about the attendants moving too slowly during loading, mocking their efficiency. When it was her turn, she pulled her restraint down, but several passengers nearby noticed she deliberately pushed the belt aside, insisting she could manage it herself. An attendant gave a quick tug on the shoulder harness, but with a full cue pressing, the check was brief. A warning announcement played, reminding riders to remain secured. But Melissa looked unconcerned. The train climbed its initial hill with the sound of clattering chains. From below, the structure loomed above the park. Riders shouted and braced as the first drop plunged into speed. The train moved smoothly through twists and turns, then approached its first inversion, a tight loop that whipped bodies upside down. Security footage later confirmed Melissa had shifted in her seat, her torso not held as firmly as others. As the train inverted, her shoulders lifted clear of the restraint. The accident unfolded in seconds. Witnesses behind her saw her body rise as if weightless, then slip free. She flailed as she cleared the harness entirely, tumbling upward before gravity pulled her down. In full view of the row behind, she struck a steel support beam with crushing force, the impact audible over the screams. Her body fell through open space and hit the ground near a service path beside the track. The train completed its circuit, riders screaming both from fear of the ride and from what they had just seen. Some were hysterical by the time the cars returned to the station, hands trembling, faces pale. Operators halted boarding immediately while security rushed to the scene. Park medics reached Melissa within minutes, but her injuries were catastrophic. Records later showed she had died on impact, with no chance of survival. Her body was removed under tarps while crowds were quietly ushered away from the area. News spread quickly across the park, but details were scarce until the evening. The coaster was shut down indefinitely for inspection. In the days after, the focus shifted less to mourning and more to the behavior that had led to the fall. Park staff documented her refusal to follow instructions, and investigators noted that the safety systems had not failed. Back in Atlanta, her workplace acknowledged her absence only briefly. Colleagues who had often found her combative did not organize tributes, and no public memorial was held. It was November 6, 2017, in New York City. The Union Square subway station was crowded with evening commuters, a familiar blend of impatience, fatigue, and routine. Announcements echoed against tiled walls, trains roared in and out, and footsteps filled the platforms. Among the hundreds passing through, one rider would not leave the station alive. Brenda Weiss was 54, a longtime New Yorker who had spent most of her career as an office administrator for a mid-level insurance firm. Known by colleagues as sharp-tongued and stubborn, she prided herself on standing her ground in any situation. Outside work, she lived alone in a small apartment in Queens and had few close friends. Public transit had been the background of her daily life for decades, but she was notorious among staff for confrontations, especially during service delays. The subway system itself is an unforgiving environment. Tracks lie in an open trough between platforms, with 2 running rails carrying the train and a third electrified rail powering it. That rail carries over 600 volts of direct current, enough to kill instantly. Platforms are lined with warning strips, and frequent announcements remind passengers never to enter the track area. Despite this, incidents occur every year, often the result of accidents, disputes, or poor judgment. That evening, Brenda was on her way home after work. Trains were delayed due to a signal issue, and the crowd at Union Square had thickened. Witnesses later reported she cut ahead in line as a packed downtown train pulled in, pushing past several younger commuters. When challenged, she raised her voice, escalating the argument into shouts. As the verbal clash grew louder, she shoved one rider who tried to block her path. The movement left her off balance at the platform's edge. In the chaos, her foot slipped against the yellow safety strip. She teetered, arms flailing, before tipping forward into the open trough. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she landed between the rails, her body inches from the electrified line. For a split second, she tried to push herself up, but her left hand made direct contact with the third rail. The effect was immediate and violent. A bright flash lit the space, followed by crackling sparks. Her body stiffened and jerked uncontrollably, muscles locked by the current. Screams erupted as the smell of burning cloth and flesh spread across the platform. Some commuters instinctively reached forward, tossing jackets and scarves, desperate to pull her clear without touching her directly. None of it worked. The current held her in place, coursing through her body until her movements slowed and stopped. Station staff triggered power cutoffs, but by then the damage was irreversible. When the current ceased, she collapsed awkwardly across the ties, smoke rising faintly from her clothing. Emergency medical teams were called by the staff, rushing down within minutes, but examination confirmed what witnesses already knew. She had suffered catastrophic burns and cardiac arrest almost instantly. The platform was cleared, trains rerouted, and police sealed off the area for investigation. Commuters were shaken, some still crying as they exited the station. Surveillance footage confirmed the sequence of events: the argument, the shove, the stumble, and the fatal contact with the rail. Unlike most transit fatalities that leave a community in shock, Brenda's passing drew little sympathy. Witnesses described her as combative even in her final minutes, screaming at strangers and forcing her way forward. Some commuters remarked afterward that her temper had written the ending as much as the third rail had. The station was cleared, power restored, and trains resumed service within hours. It was July 2, 2018 in Bakersfield, California. The afternoon heat pressed down on the city, shimmering across asphalt parking lots and roadside stalls. Families lined up at temporary stands to buy fireworks ahead of the holiday. Among the bright packaging and banners, one tent would soon turn from a place of excitement into the scene of a fatal disaster. Cynthia Lopez, 36, was known in her neighborhood for her quick temper and bluntness. A former cashier who had bounced between jobs, she carried a reputation for berating clerks and teenagers who crossed her path. She lived alone in a small rental house, often filling her evenings with TV and cigarettes. Independence mattered to her, and she prided herself on never being pushed around. In public spaces, that tendency often escalated into conflict. The fireworks stand she visited that day was a temporary structure made of canvas, stretched over metal poles, stacked inside with cardboard boxes of sparklers, rockets, and aerial shells. These tents, while licensed, always carried a margin of danger. Fireworks are composed of black powder, fuses, and chemical compounds, all highly flammable. Regulations required no open flames, visible signage for fire risks, and portable extinguishers on site. Even with precautions, a single ignition could turn the enclosed space into an inferno. That afternoon, Cynthia walked into the tent demanding a refund for a bundle of sparklers she claimed were defective. Witnesses recalled her voice rising as she berated the young staff behind the counter. The employees pointed to the posted signs. No returns and no open flames, but she waved them off. In her agitation, she lit a cigarette while still standing inside, the smoke curling above stacks of boxed fireworks. Staff pleaded with her to step outside, but she ignored the warnings. In her agitation, she dropped the lit cigarette near a partially open box of aerial shells stacked by the counter. The glowing tip rolled against loose paper wrappings and exposed fuses, which caught almost immediately. Sparks raced across the box, and within seconds the first firework ignited, spitting fire into the tent. Panic overtook the space. Employees and customers bolted for the exit, some pulling each other clear. Boxes exploded in rapid bursts, sending embers raining across the lot. Cynthia staggered back from the counter, smoke thickening around her. Witnesses outside saw her silhouette framed by fire, coughing violently, her attempts to shield herself futile against the spreading heat. The tent collapsed inward as supports gave way, flames feeding on every surface. Onlookers used extinguishers and water jugs, but the fire was too fierce, so they dialed 911. Employees dragged each other free, their clothes singed, but Cynthia never emerged. Firefighters arrived minutes later, dousing the wreckage under plumes of black smoke. When crews searched the remains, they found her body near the counter, collapsed against scorched debris. Investigators determined she had died from severe burns and smoke inhalation, likely within moments of being overwhelmed by the blaze. Neighbors who heard what happened said it sounded exactly like her, too stubborn to follow rules, even when the rules existed to keep people alive. Some remarked bitterly that she managed to turn a family fireworks stand into a war zone just by walking in. Relatives kept arrangements minimal, avoiding questions from locals who remembered her as a constant source of arguments. The fire department's final note focused on reminding the public that ignoring safety signs could put everyone at risk. It was August 6, 2016, in Killeen, Texas. The evening heat pressed against the black top of a busy local mall parking lot, where carts rattled and engines revved as shoppers hurried in and out. The lot was crowded as usual, rows of cars packed tight with families weaving between them. It was routine chaos, until a confrontation turned into something irreversible. Diane Stokes, 47, was a familiar figure in Central Texas. She drifted through clerical jobs, but was known more for her sharp temper than her work. Employees at local stores recognized her as the type to argue at length over small inconveniences. She thrived on control, pushing conflicts further than most people would dare. She was also obese, carrying well over 200 pounds on her 5'4" frame, a fact that often left her winded with exertion but unwilling to admit any limitation. Parking lots, in particular, seemed to bring out her worst, an arena where she often called out other drivers and pedestrians for imagined slights. That evening, Diane parked in a middle row, returning later to find a stray shopping cart wedged against her sedan. Nearby, a man in his 20s was gathering carts into a line. Witnesses said she immediately confronted him, shouting that he had damaged her car. The worker tried to continue his task, ignoring her as he pushed the row of metal carts forward. Diane stepped in front of them, planting herself in the narrow lane. The carts, heavy with momentum, struck her thighs, causing her to stumble. Instead of moving aside, she grabbed the side rail of one cart, yanking hard. The sudden pull destabilized the line, and the front carts jackknifed. The metal frames lurched sideways, one striking her square in the chest. Her weight worked against her. Unable to regain balance quickly, her center of gravity shifted backward. She fell hard onto the sloped asphalt, the back of her head hitting the concrete with a sharp crack. The cart, still moving, rolled partially over her legs before the worker managed to stop them. Witnesses later described the sickening sound when her skull struck the pavement, followed immediately by a dark pool spreading beneath her hair. Her size made it difficult for bystanders to move her, several struggling before realizing she was unresponsive. Some screamed, others froze, while the worker frantically tried to lift the carts off her. Diane's body twitched once, then went still, her eyes open and unresponsive. Within minutes, paramedics arrived, but nothing could be done. Afterward, there was little sympathy. Shoppers who recognized her told reporters she was the same woman they had seen berating cashiers or blocking aisles for arguments no one else wanted. Her collapse was described less as a tragedy than as the natural end of her own confrontational habits. The mall returned to business within hours, quietly noting they would remember the incident more as a disruption than a loss. It was September 12, 2015, and the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns of Sunset Ridge, an exclusive gated community in Scottsdale, Arizona. The 4,200-square-foot clubhouse buzzed with tension as nearly 80 residents filed into the main conference room, their voices creating an anxious murmur that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. The smell of fresh coffee from the hospitality station mixed with the faint scent of desert sage that drifted through the open windows. Patricia Whitfield adjusted her reading glasses one final time as she surveyed the crowd from behind the mahogany podium, her perfectly styled blonde hair not moving despite the gentle breeze from the air conditioning. At 52, the tyrannical HOA president had spent 6 years transforming the once peaceful community into her personal kingdom of rules and regulations. Her day job as a high-end real estate agent provided the income to support her obsessive lifestyle, but controlling her neighbors had become her true calling. Patricia carried a measuring tape and digital camera everywhere, documenting violations with the precision of a crime scene investigator. Her daily patrol routes covered every inch of the community's 240 acres, and she maintained detailed files on each of the 156 households. Residents had learned to peek through their curtains before stepping outside, knowing that Patricia might be lurking nearby with her citation book. Her aggressive enforcement had pushed several families into costly disputes over fines and legal fees. The Hendersons eventually sold their home after repeated citations over minor property issues escalated into thousands of dollars in penalties. Another family left after a prolonged conflict over landscaping rules, leaving neighbors wary of Patricia's zero-tolerance approach. Patricia took immense pride in her zero-tolerance policy and frequently boasted to other HOA presidents about maintaining the highest property values in Maricopa County. She had called tonight's special meeting to discuss her latest crusade: new restrictions that would ban all outdoor holiday decorations and limit pet ownership to one small dog per household. The meeting began with Patricia's characteristic intensity as she clicked through her PowerPoint presentation, each slide detailing new violations she had discovered and the corresponding fines she planned to implement. Her voice grew more shrill as residents began questioning her authority, their frustration evident after years of living under her oppressive rule. Patricia raised her voice as she pointed to photos of Halloween displays, insisting they lowered property values. She then turned to pet owners, blaming large dogs for the constant noise. To drive her point home, she stepped onto a chair at the front of the room. The frame shifted unsteadily beneath her weight as she continued addressing the crowd. Without warning, one of the chair's legs gave way. Patricia fell backward, her head striking the stone fireplace hearth with a sharp crack that silenced the room. The impact fractured her neck instantly, and she collapsed to the floor without movement. Blood began pooling around Patricia's head as shocked residents fumbled for their phones to call 911. She lay motionless, still clutching her violation citation book, her final words having been threats about implementing $100 daily fines for Christmas decorations. The paramedics arrived within 12 minutes, but Patricia Whitfield was pronounced dead at the scene. The HOA dissolved within 6 months, as residents voted overwhelmingly to eliminate the oppressive rules Patricia had implemented. Property values actually increased once the community became known for its welcoming atmosphere rather than strict regulations. The clubhouse fireplace was removed and replaced with a memorial garden promoting community harmony, though few mourned Patricia's passing. It was March 8, 2014, and the mild evening air carried the sounds of clinking glasses and animated conversation through the historic district of Charleston, South Carolina. Giuseppe's Italian restaurant hummed with activity as nearly 60 diners enjoyed their meals in the elegantly appointed dining room, the soft lighting from crystal chandeliers creating an intimate atmosphere. The aroma of garlic and fresh basil filled the air, mixing with the subtle scent of aged wine from the restaurant's extensive collection. Brenda Pemberton adjusted her designer reading glasses as she surveyed the menu with the calculating gaze of someone preparing for battle. At 47, the insurance claims adjuster had built a notorious reputation throughout Charleston's restaurant scene as a serial complainer who turned every dining experience into an opportunity for confrontation and compensation. Her pattern of exaggerated grievances and threats of lawsuits had made her a dreaded customer at establishments across the Southeast. Restaurant managers throughout Charleston knew Brenda by name and would often comp her meals preemptively to avoid the lengthy confrontations that could last for hours and disrupt their other customers. Her insurance background had taught her exactly which complaints would generate the fastest results and how to phrase her grievances to suggest potential liability issues that restaurant owners feared most. Brenda had developed a systematic approach to her restaurant complaints, always arriving with a mental list of potential issues she could exploit. She understood how to escalate minor service problems into major incidents that would result in free meals, cash settlements, or both. Local restaurant staff had learned to recognize her tactics, but many establishments still found it easier to appease her than to deal with the scenes she would create. Tonight's target was Giuseppe's, an upscale establishment she had been planning to visit for months. She arrived with her usual arsenal of potential complaints, having researched the restaurant's online reviews to identify service issues that other customers had mentioned. Her goal was ambitious: a full refund plus additional compensation for what she would claim was unacceptable treatment. Brenda began her usual routine immediately, loudly criticizing the bread temperature and demanding to speak with the manager before her appetizer arrived. When manager Tony Ricci politely offered to replace her meal, Brenda escalated the situation by throwing her wine glass against the wall, the crystal shattering as it struck the exposed brick. She stood on her chair to address the entire dining room, shouting accusations about the restaurant's service and demanding satisfaction for her treatment. In her dramatic performance, she gestured wildly with her arms while berating the staff and threatening legal action against the establishment. During her theatrical display, Brenda knocked over a large decorative wine barrel that had been positioned near her table as part of the restaurant's rustic Italian theme. The empty oak barrel, used purely for decoration but improperly secured to its base, tipped forward from her movement and rolled toward the wall. The barrel struck Brenda's torso and pinned her against the brick surface. The impact fractured several ribs and compressed her chest cavity, preventing her from breathing properly. Witnesses said she gasped once before collapsing to the floor. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but she was unresponsive and later pronounced dead at the scene. Emergency medical personnel arrived quickly, but were unable to revive her. The restaurant faced a wrongful death lawsuit from Brenda's family, though security footage clearly documented her aggressive behavior leading up to the accident. Other local establishments came forward with evidence of her pattern of fraudulent complaints, creating a complex legal situation. The lawsuit was ultimately unsuccessful, but Giuseppe's installed safety barriers around all decorative items and implemented staff training for handling difficult customers. Brenda's death became a cautionary tale in Charleston's restaurant community about the dangers of escalating customer service disputes. It was November 15, 2016, and the crisp autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves across the parking lot of Maple Grove Elementary School in Minnesota. The school auditorium buzzed with tension as nearly 150 parents, teachers, and board members filled the folding chairs, their voices creating an anxious murmur that echoed off the 20-foot ceiling. The fluorescent lights cast harsh shadows across the institutional beige walls decorated with student artwork. Susan Hutchinson adjusted her stack of printed research articles as she prepared for what she considered her most important presentation yet. At 49, the pharmaceutical sales representative had become a familiar presence at every school board meeting over the past 3 years. Known for her persistence and increasingly forceful positions, she often cited medical terminology and research articles to support her arguments. Her background in pharmaceutical sales lent her authority when she spoke, though her interpretations of the studies she referenced were often incomplete. Over time, her advocacy campaigns led to several staff departures and curriculum changes, prompting concern among teachers and administrators. What began as parent involvement gradually grew into a cycle of conflict that left the school community divided. Her latest crusade involved demanding the complete removal of all technology from classrooms, claiming that Wi-Fi signals caused irreversible brain damage in developing children. She had spent weeks preparing tonight's presentation, complete with cherry-picked studies and inflammatory rhetoric designed to terrify other parents into supporting her cause. Susan's own children had become increasingly isolated as other families avoided association with her extremist views. Teachers walked on eggshells around her kids, afraid that any perceived slight would trigger another of Susan's explosive confrontations with the administration. As Susan began her impassioned speech about the dangers of wireless technology, her voice grew increasingly shrill and her gestures more erratic. She had been experiencing severe chest pains and shortness of breath for weeks, but attributed her symptoms to the school's wireless network, rather than the chronic stress of her constant outrage. She raised her voice, waving papers frantically, and insisting Wi-Fi signals were harming children. Her face had turned bright red, and sweat beaded on her forehead despite the cool evening temperature. As she continued her presentation about the alleged dangers of wireless technology, suddenly, Susan clutched her chest with both hands, her eyes widening in terror as crushing pain radiated down her left arm. She stumbled backward from the podium, her breathing turned shallow. Between strained gasps, she repeated that the Wi-Fi was making her sick before collapsing onto the auditorium floor as board members and parents rushed to help. She suffered a massive heart attack linked to chronic hypertension and stress. Despite the quick response of paramedics, Susan Hutchinson was pronounced dead at Maple Grove Hospital at 9:23 p.m., her final words being demands that the Wi-Fi was killing her. The autopsy revealed severe coronary artery disease exacerbated by chronic stress and hypertension. Her group faded, and the board emphasized respectful debate at future meetings. The school board also established a mental health awareness program for parents struggling with education-related anxiety. It was December 23rd, 2017, and the holiday shopping frenzy filled the air at Pioneer Place Mall in Portland, Oregon. The Nordstrom department store buzzed with last-minute shoppers as nearly 200 customers navigated the crowded aisles, their voices creating a symphony of holiday stress and excitement. The scent of expensive perfume from the cosmetics counter mixed with the aroma of cinnamon from the nearby food court. Linda Blackwood wheeled her shopping cart toward the customer service counter with the confidence of someone who had done this many times before. At 44, the mortgage broker had developed a pattern of fraudulent returns over the past several years, purchasing items, using them extensively, then returning them with fabricated complaints and demands for compensation. Linda had become a known problem customer at multiple retailers throughout the Pacific Northwest, with store employees learning to recognize her frequent attempts to return obviously used merchandise. She had been banned from several stores but continued her schemes by shopping at different locations and using various excuses for her returns. Her cart contained clearly used items, a designer handbag with visible wear marks, shoes that had obviously been worn outdoors, and clothing with deodorant stains and missing tags. Linda had prepared an elaborate story about receiving defective merchandise as gifts, complete with fake receipts and manufactured outrage. The customer service manager, Jennifer Walsh, recognized Linda immediately from previous encounters and reports from other stores. The store had been documenting her fraudulent activities for months, building a case with security footage and coordination with other retailers. Tonight would mark the end of Linda's return scam operation. When Jennifer politely refused the return of the clearly damaged designer handbag, Linda's carefully constructed facade crumbled instantly. Her face contorted with rage as she began shouting threats and accusations, her voice carrying across the entire store. Other customers backed away as Linda's tantrum escalated into violence. She shouted accusations across the store and threatened legal action against the company. In her fury, she began grabbing merchandise from nearby displays and hurling it at the customer service counter. Linda seized a heavy crystal vase from a holiday display, raising it above her head with both hands. Linda hurled the vase toward Jennifer's head, but the manager ducked behind the counter just in time. The heavy crystal struck the wall and shattered on impact. A large fragment deflected off the surface and hit Linda on the side of the neck, severing a major artery. She pressed her hand to the wound and collapsed among the merchandise as blood pooled across the floor. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but she was pronounced dead at the scene while shocked shoppers looked on. Security footage revealed the full extent of Linda's return fraud scheme, leading to a posthumous investigation that uncovered tens of thousands of dollars in fraudulent returns. Multiple retailers provided evidence of her activities, and her family discovered significant credit card debt that highlighted the scope of her fraudulent operations. It was July 4th, 2013, and the oppressive Florida heat shimmered off the asphalt of West Shore Plaza's parking lot in Tampa. The shopping center buzzed with holiday activity, as nearly 500 cars filled the sprawling lot, their occupants seeking air-conditioned relief from the 95-degree temperature. The smell of hot asphalt mixed with exhaust fumes and the distant aroma of barbecue from a nearby restaurant. Deborah Morrison adjusted her homemade parking enforcement badge as she surveyed the parking lot with the authority of a self-appointed monitor. At 51, the bank manager had developed an obsession with parking violations at the mall, carrying printed notices and a digital camera to document what she considered improper parking. Her behavior had cost her friendships and strained her marriage, but she refused to abandon what she saw as her duty. Deborah kept records of license plates and would call police to report violations, even when no actual laws had been broken. She had confronted numerous shoppers over the past 2 years, turning minor parking disputes into major confrontations that often required security intervention. Mall management had repeatedly asked her to stop, but she insisted she was providing a public service. Her latest targets were a young family loading groceries into their SUV. The Johnsons had parked legally within the designated lines, but Deborah believed they were too close to the cart return area, violating her personal interpretation of parking regulations. Deborah positioned herself directly behind their vehicle while taking photos of their license plate, shouting about parking violations and threatening to call police. The father, Mark Johnson, tried to ignore her while securing his children in their car seats, but Deborah's harassment continued to escalate. When Mark began backing out slowly, Deborah deliberately positioned herself behind the moving vehicle, refusing to move despite his warnings. She pounded on the rear window while continuing her complaints about parking violations, her face red with rage in the sweltering heat. The SUV's rear bumper struck Deborah as she moved closer to prevent their departure. The impact knocked her backward onto the concrete, and her head struck the curb. The sound echoed across the parking lot as witnesses called for help. But Deborah Morrison died from severe brain trauma. Security footage showed Deborah's aggressive behavior and deliberate positioning behind the moving vehicle. The driver was initially charged with vehicular manslaughter, but charges were dropped when witnesses testified about her actions. The mall hired professional parking attendants and installed additional security cameras following the incident. It was August 19, 2018, and the cool mountain air carried the sounds of urban life through the courtyard of Pine Ridge Apartments in Denver, Colorado. The three-story complex housed nearly 200 residents in 80 units, their evening routines creating the normal symphony of apartment living. The scent of dinner preparations drifted from open windows, mixing with the fresh smell of recently watered landscaping. Margaret Daniels pressed her ear against the wall, separating her unit from her neighbors, her decibel meter registering the faint sound of a television at normal volume. At 46, the government clerk had developed an obsession with noise complaints, filing numerous formal grievances during her 2 years of residency. Her persistent complaints had resulted in several families moving out of the complex. Margaret documented sounds throughout the day, maintaining logs with timestamps and decibel readings. She would pound on walls and ceilings at various hours, demanding quiet from neighbors who were conducting normal daily activities. Her apartment contained multiple sound monitoring devices and stacks of complaint documentation. The upstairs neighbors, the Chen family, had endured months of Margaret's complaints about normal activities like walking across their floor and watching television at reasonable volumes. Tonight, their 8-year-old daughter was practicing piano at 7 p.m., well within the building's designated quiet hours that didn't begin until 10 p.m. Margaret became increasingly agitated as the piano music drifted through the ceiling. She grabbed her decibel meter and complaint forms, going upstairs to confront the family about what she considered excessive noise. Her pounding on their door echoed through the hallway, but the Chens had learned to ignore her complaints. Frustrated by their refusal to answer, Margaret retrieved a maintenance ladder from the storage closet and positioned it against the building's exterior wall. She planned to climb onto the Chen's second-floor balcony to continue her confrontation, bypassing their locked door. The wooden balcony railing, installed when the complex was built in 1987, had been weakened by 31 years of Colorado weather extremes. Freeze-thaw cycles had loosened the bolts, and recent heavy rains had rotted the support posts, though the damage wasn't visible from ground level. Margaret climbed the ladder with her complaint notebook tucked under her arm and her decibel meter hanging from her belt. At 5 feet 6 inches and 160 pounds, she represented a significant load for the compromised railing system. Other residents watched from their windows as she reached the balcony level, some recording the scene on their phones. Margaret pounded on the sliding glass door while the Chen family remained inside. She leaned her full weight against the railing to get closer to the window, applying pressure to the weakest section of the deteriorated structure. The railing gave way with a sharp crack that echoed through the courtyard. Margaret fell 3 stories onto the concrete courtyard below, her body striking the pavement with an impact that could be heard throughout the complex. The fall created a loud disturbance that startled neighbors who had been sleeping peacefully despite her constant complaints about normal living sounds. She died instantly from multiple fractures and massive internal injuries, her decibel meter shattered beside her body. The apartment complex faced liability issues for the unsafe balcony railing that hadn't been properly maintained or inspected. A structural engineer's report revealed that multiple balconies throughout the property had similar deterioration, leading to a renovation project. Neighbors provided evidence of Margaret's harassment campaign, documenting her behavior toward families conducting normal daily activities. The Chen family moved out within a month following the incident. New building management implemented policies requiring mediation before eviction proceedings for noise complaints. They installed soundproofing in units with shared walls and established quiet hours that balanced residents' rights to both peace and normal living activities. The complex installed safety barriers around all balconies and implemented regular structural inspections. Margaret's apartment was converted into a community room where residents could resolve disputes through mediation. It was July 19, 2018, in Tampa, Florida. A humid afternoon with heat shimmering off the pavement of a strip mall parking lot. The lunchtime rush was steady at a small cafe known for its drive-through coffee line that often wrapped around the building. Most customers waited patiently in the slow crawl of cars, but one driver stood out that day. 44-year-old Darlene Cooper, a part-time insurance clerk who came by a few times a week. Co-workers later said Darlene had a habit of recording minor confrontations on her phone, whether it was with store clerks, delivery drivers, or neighbors. That afternoon, she ordered a large hot coffee and a muffin from the cafe. When the drink was handed to her through the window, she lifted the cup, looked at the lid, and complained that it wasn't filled all the way. The worker apologized and offered to make a new one, but Darlene began raising her voice, drawing attention from other cars in line. Witnesses in nearby cars said she began shouting that she was being cheated out of her money. The cashier tried again to hand her a new cup, but Darlene tossed the one she'd been given through the open window. The coffee splashed across the counter and hit a young worker's arm. Security footage later showed staff stepping back in shock as Darlene drove forward a few feet, threw her SUV into park, and got out. She walked quickly toward the window, still holding her phone up in front of her. The video later recovered from that phone showed her yelling about poor service, demanding the worker's name, and pacing near the concrete post that marked the edge of the drive-through lane. The manager inside told her to leave, or he would call the police. Instead, she turned sharply and walked back toward her vehicle, muttering that she had evidence. Customers in line behind her recalled that she was still recording while pulling open the driver door. The air outside was thick, over 90 degrees, and the sound of idling engines mixed with her shouting. She set her phone on the dashboard mount, half inside the car, half standing outside. The door was still wide open. According to investigators who later reviewed the footage, what happened next lasted less than 5 seconds. Darlene swung her leg inside, trying to slam the door shut with her left hand while keeping her phone balanced on the dashboard mount. The engine was still running, and as she moved to sit back down, her foot pressed the accelerator instead of the brake. The SUV jerked forward with a short screech of tires. The open door hit the concrete post beside her parking space. The metal folded backward, trapping her between the door's inner edge and the car frame. The force crushed her upper chest against the steering column. The phone recording captured a burst of noise, then went still. A man 2 cars behind witnessed the entire impact. He said he first thought the vehicle had simply stalled, but when he saw Darlene's body pinned in the doorway, he jumped out of his car and ran toward her. The engine was still revving in gear, wheels spinning against the curb. He tried pulling the handle, but the twisted door was jammed against the post. Another driver shouted for someone to turn off the ignition. A woman reached through the passenger side to switch it off, but by then there was no movement from Darlene. The cafe staff locked the drive-through window and called emergency services, while the line of cars backed away to give space. Responders later said that the position of the SUV and the bent metal frame made extraction difficult. It took several minutes to pry the door loose enough to reach her paramedics, later noted severe chest trauma, consistent with high compression from the door hinge. Investigators pieced together the timeline mostly from her own phone. The video began with her ordering coffee and continued all the way through her shouting at staff, walking back to the SUV, and getting in. The final image froze on the steering wheel a split second before the sound of impact. Authorities classified the death as accidental, caused by blunt force injuries to the chest. They noted there was no evidence of mechanical failure, only driver error combined with distraction. Witnesses confirmed that the outburst over the half-filled cup lasted nearly 3 minutes before the fatal moment. By evening, the cafe reopened the lane. The bent post stayed for days while the video remained unreleased, though investigators confirmed it captured the full argument. The case was ruled an accidental death, a fatal mistake that turned an ordinary argument over coffee into a tragedy. It was March 22, 2019 in Sedona, Arizona, a bright, windy afternoon that drew steady weekend crowds to the Red Rock lookouts along State Route 89A. The Vista Point near Cathedral Rock was busy that afternoon, with tourists taking photos and families walking up the gravel trail leading to the elevated overlook. Among the visitors was 53-year-old Denise Harper, who had arrived with relatives in 2 cars after a long lunch downtown. Denise was a former receptionist who began using a small, 3-wheeled travel scooter after a knee injury she sustained during an argument at a shopping center several years earlier. According to family, she enjoyed visiting scenic areas and was confident operating the scooter on paved surfaces. That afternoon, she decided to follow her relatives partway up the viewing path, despite the posted sign restricting motorized vehicles beyond the parking lot. The trail itself was a narrow service road converted into a pedestrian path, climbing at a shallow angle before curving toward the overlook. Fine sandstone gravel lined the edges, and the drop-off on one side sloped several dozen feet down to a rocky basin. Visitors often paused midway to take pictures of the valley, leaning against the low wooden rail that served more as a marker than a barrier. Witnesses later told investigators that Denise appeared cheerful, but dismissive when others cautioned her about the trail's slope. A volunteer guide near the base reminded visitors that motorized scooters weren't recommended past the paved section, but Denise waved him off and continued upward. Family members said she insisted she knew what she was doing. The scooter's rear tires slipped occasionally on loose grit as she maneuvered around small rocks about halfway up. The incline steepened slightly. By 3:15 p.m., the family had reached a rest area just below the main overlook platform. Denise stopped a few yards behind them and took out her phone to take a panoramic photo. Witnesses nearby said she began adjusting her position to frame the background better, reversing slightly toward the open edge where the gravel thinned. Footage from another tourist's camera, later reviewed by investigators, showed the scooter's rear wheels spinning briefly before sliding over the worn edge of the trail. The combination of incline and loose rock caused the scooter to tilt backward. Denise instinctively leaned forward and turned the handlebars, but the shift in weight caused the left wheel to lift completely off the ground. Within seconds, the scooter tipped sideways and went over the slope. Several witnesses shouted as the chair rolled down the incline, striking rocks and brush before coming to rest roughly 20 feet below. Family members ran down the slope while others called 911. The fall had dislodged the scooter's seat and battery pack, both found a few feet away from where Denise lay motionless. Emergency crews from a local fire department arrived at 3:26 p.m. and used a rope line to access the area. Paramedics confirmed no signs of life at the scene. The county medical examiner later determined the cause of death as blunt force trauma to the head and upper torso, consistent with impact during a fall. Investigators from the sheriff's office documented tire marks leading from the main trail to the edge, confirming the scooter's loss of traction rather than intentional movement. The device's controls were found functioning normally, ruling out a mechanical malfunction. Authorities concluded that the fall was an accidental loss of control, compounded by unsuitable terrain. While the sign restricting motorized use was clearly visible at the trail entrance, no physical barrier prevented access. The overlook remained temporarily closed for safety assessment. Within a week, local officials installed reinforced fencing and additional signage warning visitors about unstable ground and prohibiting scooters, strollers, or wheeled equipment beyond the pavement. The family later told investigators they believed Denise had simply wanted a better view for her photo and underestimated how quickly the scooter could shift on loose rock. It was May 13, 2017, in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, a warm Saturday morning when the aisles of a local discount supermarket were packed with weekend shoppers. The steady hum of carts and checkout scanners filled the air. At Register 6, the line stretched nearly to the back of the produce section as people waited to pay for groceries and household items. Among them was Patricia Larkin, known by many in her neighborhood as Patty. She was 52, a retired librarian who lived alone on the east side of town. Former co-workers described her as outspoken, someone who never hesitated to correct others in public if she thought they were wrong. She came to the store regularly, often mid-morning on weekends when lines were longest. At around 10:40 a.m., surveillance footage later showed Patty pushing her cart past at least 5 customers in line at the self-checkout area. She positioned her cart directly behind another shopper who was placing items on the conveyor. A man in his 30s wearing a gray sweatshirt told her the end of the line was behind him. Witnesses said she looked straight at him and raised her voice, saying she didn't have time to deal with delays. Several people in line turned their heads as her voice carried through the checkout area. The man repeated himself, gesturing toward the line that extended behind the soda display. Instead of moving, Patty gripped her cart and pushed it forward, striking the back of the man's legs. The sound of metal wheels against the tile floor made several people step back. A store employee at the service counter began walking toward the commotion, but before he reached them, multiple shoppers had already started recording with their phones. The video later confirmed that the man did not retaliate. He stepped aside, raising his hands in disbelief, while Patty began unloading her groceries onto the belt. One of the witnesses, a woman near the express lane, told investigators that Patty seemed flustered and was muttering under her breath as she reached for items from her cart. Her movements were quick and jerky. Another customer, standing 2 registers away, said she complained that the store needed better trained staff. At that point, the manager on duty, identified later in reports as David Hall, approached from the customer service counter. He stood a few feet away and asked her to step aside to resolve the issue calmly. Patty turned, one hand still gripping her cart handle. Her body was angled halfway between the belt and the aisle divider. The surveillance footage captured what happened next. As she turned to respond, the front wheel of her shopping cart caught the edge of the metal guardrail that lined the base of the conveyor. When she tried to shift her foot, her right shoe slipped between the small gap near the rail. The cart tilted slightly, and she instinctively yanked her leg back to free herself. That movement caused her to lose balance. She stumbled backward, her arms flailing briefly before her body hit the floor. Her head struck the corner of a low-standing freezer that held packaged meat products near the checkout area. The impact produced a dull, heavy sound that was clearly audible on the store's security audio. Witnesses said the entire area went silent. A woman screamed for help, and several shoppers backed away, leaving their carts behind. The man she had argued with stood motionless, still holding his phone. The manager knelt beside Patty, who remained unresponsive. Another employee called 911 from the service counter while customers began clearing the surrounding lanes. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but emergency personnel later confirmed she had sustained a fatal skull fracture and brain hemorrhage from the impact. Security footage showed that the entire confrontation, from the moment she cut the line to the moment she fell, lasted less than 2 minutes. Store policy required a full shutdown of the affected checkout area, and customers were redirected to the remaining lanes. By 11:15 a.m., yellow tape surrounded registers 6 and 7, while police reviewed footage and took statements. Her cart remained across 2 lanes, half filled with groceries. Investigators ruled the death an accidental fall caused by imbalance and blunt force trauma. The store reopened that evening, adding padding to the freezer corner involved in the incident. It was September 10, 2016, in Plano, Texas, an early evening just after a passing thunderstorm. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving shallow puddles across the wide parking lot of a suburban grocery complex. The wet asphalt reflected the glow of overhead lights and the red brake beams of shoppers pulling out with weekend groceries. Rhonda Ellis, 46, was a self-employed real estate agent who managed several rental properties in the area. Tenants and co-workers described her as assertive, often getting into minor arguments over parking, delivery access, or who had the right to certain spaces. Her silver crossover SUV was parked several rows from the store entrance as she waited for her husband to arrive in a second vehicle. Around 6:20 p.m., a blue sedan turned into the same aisle. Security footage later showed it slowing as it approached an open parking space only a few feet from where Rhonda was standing. As the driver angled to pull in, Rhonda stepped forward and stood in the middle of the space, motioning with her hands for the car to stop. The sedan paused, blinkers still on. The driver rolled down the window and said something, but the camera's audio didn't pick it up. Witnesses nearby later told police they heard Rhonda insisting that the space was meant for her husband, who was on his way. When the driver gave up and turned toward another row, she remained standing there for a few seconds with her arms crossed before walking back toward her SUV, shaking her head. Footage showed her pulling a set of car keys from her jacket pocket and tossing them down in frustration. The keys bounced once and landed beside a metal light pole base, where water had pooled from the earlier rain. She walked over to pick them up, unaware that the metal housing around the pole's base had been corroded for months. Maintenance records would later show that the wiring inside had been flagged for repair twice earlier that year, but never serviced. Moisture from the storm had seeped into the cracked seal, exposing a live wire that made intermittent contact with the metal casing whenever it was wet. Rhonda crouched beside the pole and reached down with her right hand. According to two shoppers across the aisle, there was a sudden blue-white flash, followed by a loud pop. Rhonda's body stiffened, and she let out a single sharp scream before collapsing sideways onto the wet ground. Her right hand was still gripping the key ring, which was partly submerged in the shallow puddle. A man loading groceries into his truck stopped when he saw the flash and realized she had collapsed. He stepped forward but froze when he noticed small sparks dancing across the puddle around the pole. Others nearby hesitated too, unsure what had happened. One shopper yelled for everyone to stay back while someone inside the store alerted employees. Within minutes, workers used cones and carts to block off the aisle, as the smell of burned plastic and faint electrical crackling filled the air. Fire department responders reached the scene at 6:31 p.m. and immediately cut power to the entire lighting circuit for the lot. Paramedics approached once the voltage was confirmed off, but Rhonda was already unresponsive. She was pronounced dead at the scene. The medical examiner later identified electrocution as the cause of death, consistent with high-voltage contact through a conductive surface in standing water. Investigators found that corrosion in an underground junction had caused a short during the storm. Tests showed the current reached over 200 volts, strong enough to stop a heartbeat instantly. The store closed the section that night for inspection. Records revealed earlier repair requests were ignored. By the next day, city crews sealed all pole bases and added warning signs while planning full rewiring. It was November 8, 2015, in Mesa, Arizona, a dry, cool afternoon that brought steady weekend traffic into the Crosswinds shopping plaza. Inside the strip mall's small pet store, the usual chatter of birds and hum of aquarium filters filled the air. Employees were busy tending to customers buying food, tanks, and small animals. At around 3:20 p.m., the store's front counter area became the scene of an argument that would end in a sudden and tragic accident. The customer was 39-year-old Sharon Malloy, an office administrator and divorced mother of one who lived a few miles away. She was a regular at the store, often stopping by for bird feed and supplies. Employees described her as outspoken, known for questioning prices and frequently asking for discounts on items she thought were overpriced. That day, Sharon came in asking about a small parakeet she'd seen on a previous visit. The bird had been part of a local rescue program that worked with the shop, and its adoption fee was listed at $25 to cover care and medical costs. According to witnesses, Sharon argued that the store shouldn't charge for rescued animals. She spoke loudly enough that nearby customers turned to look. The employee at the counter, a college student working part-time, tried explaining that the fee went to the rescue organization, not the store itself. Sharon didn't accept the explanation and kept arguing, insisting the fee was unfair. She lifted a small metal bird cage from her cart and began pointing out its flaws: bent bars, a loose latch, chipped paint along the bottom edge. Witnesses said she waved it slightly as she spoke, her movements sharp enough that the employee stepped back from the counter. The store's security footage showed Sharon setting the cage down hard on the counter, then lifting it again in frustration. Behind her, another customer quietly moved away from the register area. When she slammed the cage down a second time, its lower edge struck the electrical cord of a heat lamp that was clamped to a reptile tank nearby. The lamp jolted loose and dropped behind the counter, hitting a plastic bottle of glass cleaner stored on a lower shelf. The cleaner contained ammonia and alcohol-based solvents, common in commercial products but highly flammable. The bulb, still hot from continuous use, shattered on impact. In the same instant, the escaping vapor ignited, producing a brief but intense flash. Employees described hearing a sharp pop and seeing a burst of orange flame that spread upward from the floor to the counter. Sharon's blouse, made of lightweight polyester, caught fire almost immediately. Surveillance video later showed her stepping back in shock, waving her arms as the fabric began to melt against her skin. 2 employees rushed forward. One grabbed a towel from the grooming station, while another unplugged the lamp's power cord. They managed to smother the flames within seconds, but by then Sharon had suffered severe burns to her upper torso and right arm. A customer ran outside to flag down a passing patrol car, and the officer radioed for paramedics. Emergency responders arrived within minutes and transported Sharon to a nearby burn center. She was pronounced dead later that evening due to thermal injuries and secondary complications from smoke inhalation. The fire department investigation concluded that the ignition was accidental, but preventable. Inspectors noted that the lamp's power cord had been improperly routed near cleaning supplies, and the clamp securing the fixture to the tank had loosened from repeated use. Although the heat output was within normal range, contact with the flammable vapors was enough to start the flash fire. Investigators ruled the fire an accident caused by unsafe equipment placement, with no criminal charges filed. The store closed for cleanup and repairs as inspectors documented burn damage across the counter and shelving. It reopened a week later with new glass enclosures for all heat lamps, added safety guards, and warning signs reminding customers to keep items clear of electrical cords. It was August 4, 2017 in Eugene, Oregon, a Friday night when the downtown multiplex was packed for the late showing of a new superhero movie. The air smelled of popcorn and soda, and ushers moved between theaters cleaning up from earlier showings. Inside Auditorium 6, where the 10:30 p.m. screening was just beginning, 48-year-old Linda Sinclair had already taken a seat in the middle row, sipping from a large drink and scrolling through her phone. Linda worked as a retail supervisor at a clothing outlet nearby and was known to coworkers as outspoken and sometimes argumentative. According to friends, she often came to late movies alone after having drinks at a bar down the street that night. She had purchased a general admission ticket, but sat in a seat marked as reserved, part of the theater's new numbered seating system that had caused confusion and frequent disputes since being introduced a few months earlier. At 10:37 p.m., a couple entered and walked toward the center of the row where Linda was seated. Their tickets showed the same seat number she occupied, and they asked her to move. Witnesses said she refused, insisting she had arrived first. The couple went to get assistance, and 2 ushers returned a few minutes later, checking tickets under the dim theater lighting. When they asked her to move to her assigned seat, she declined. Security footage showed Linda standing, holding her phone, and arguing with staff while waiting for a manager. When he approached, she began recording, and nearby patrons started watching as the dispute grew louder. As the ushers stood their ground, Linda began stepping backward, trying to keep all 3 employees in her camera frame. The stadium-style seating had narrow, steep steps between each row, with just enough width for a single foot. Witnesses seated 2 rows below later said she moved without looking behind her. When her heel landed partly off the step, her weight shifted suddenly. Her left ankle twisted and she lost balance. In one motion, her body tipped backward into the aisle. The fall covered about 5 feet in elevation, enough to generate a strong impact. Her head struck the steel base of the aisle handrail before her phone slid down several steps, its flashlight still on. The theater went silent for several seconds before a man near the aisle called out for help. Staff immediately stopped the film and turned on the overhead lights. The ushers moved the crowd back while one checked for a pulse. A nurse who happened to be in the audience assisted until paramedics arrived roughly 7 minutes later. Linda was unresponsive and was later pronounced dead at the hospital from blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. Police reviewed the footage from both the theater cameras and audience phones. The investigation determined the fall was accidental and that staff had acted appropriately. Toxicology tests found moderate alcohol levels in her system, but no drugs. The medical examiner confirmed a fatal skull fracture consistent with impact against a fixed metal surface. The theater reopened the next day, but implemented new safety and seating protocols. Ushers were instructed to verify reserved seating before each showing to prevent disputes. and small warning signs were added to stairway entries reminding patrons to watch their steps. Staff later said it was the first and only fatal accident the location had ever experienced, an argument that turned tragic within seconds. Thanks for watching. Want to watch more? Click on your screen now.